So the movie that I chose to watch was Mr. Holland's Opus. This happens to be a personal favorite of mine, and I actually happen to have it on DVD. The movie follows the career of this teacher, Mr. Holland, who kind of reluctantly gets into teaching music at a high school. He calls it his fallback career. And it follows his 30-year career teaching music at this high school where, again, he kind of went into it kicking and screaming. And then by the end of it, he says, there's nothing else that he would rather do. This is what he always wanted. We see him kind of progress through his career. We see the student body changing. We see the times, the community changing as well. But we also get to see kind of the struggle that he has as a teacher, as a father, and as a person who wanted to spend his time doing something other than teaching, which was composing. And so the magnus of the movie, the career-ending moment in the movie is this opus that he's been trying to write for 30 plus years. And a lot of his former students come back to help perform this song, that he's been composing for 30 years. But one of the points that they make right at this retirement, which is, it's a forced retirement, the school board's cutting the arts program. But one of the points that they make is that his opus is the students and the lives in the community that he's touched around him. One of the central characters in the movie is his son Cole. And Cole ends up having a hearing problem. And so what we end up finding out in the movie is there's a scene in the movie where Mr. Holland has been tasked with creating a marching band, and they're performing at a parade. It's their very first parade that they're marching in, and they march by, and right behind them is their fire truck, and this fire truck lets out this very, very, very loud noise, and everybody in the crowd covers their ears because it's so loud. Kids are crying and they're covering their ears, and Iris, Mr. Holland's wife, goes to comfort Cole, who's in a stroller at this point, and he's passed out, dead asleep to the world. Now that in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything. In fact, I probably would have been that child, totally passed out and dead to the world. The bomb could have exploded next to my head and I never would have noticed it. But the very next scene, Mr. Holland's coming back from the parade, and Iris says to Mr. Holland, Glenn, I think there might be something wrong with Cole. I tried banging pots behind his back and no reaction. I tried clapping and calling his name, nothing. I'd stomp on the floor and he'd turn around and he'd see me and he'd start laughing and thinking I was playing around. But if I tried sneaking up on him, he wouldn't react to me at all. And so then we would see Mr. Holland trying to do the same kind of thing, clapping and calling his name, and no reaction whatsoever out of Cole. The scene following that is Mr. Holland and his wife meeting with a specialist, and they're discussing Cole. And what we find out is that Cole has a 90% hearing loss. And the specialist recommends not using gestures, recommends taking him to a specialist to work on vocal coaching, and that they're going to work on what little hearing he has so that way he can verbalize and talk in a hearing world, which was a very common kind of approach to hearing loss at that time. And again, you've got to remember that this movie starts in about the 1950s and progresses up to, I think it's about 1990s, early 1990s is when the movie ends. So it's probably the late 1950s, early 1960s is when the movie starts, ends in around the 1990s. And so when Cole is born, which is very early on in the movie, this was a common kind of approach to students that had a hearing loss was, we're not going to teach them sign language. We're not going to go with gestures. We're going to try to force them to learn how to lip read. We're going to try to force them to interact in a hearing world. And so they start trying to do this, and we see a couple of scenes where Mr. Holland is having a difficult time with it. As a music teacher, he wants to share his passion and love for music with his son, but he doesn't know how to do this with a son who's deaf and can't hear anything. At least that's the way it's being portrayed. His wife, on the other hand, we see her working with his son on trying to understand mouth movements and facial movements to be able to vocalize, what he wants and to be able to communicate. A little bit later on in the movie, Cole's a little bit older, and there's a breakdown in at home, and Cole wants something and he can't communicate, and he's frustrated, and he's banging things, and he's just incredibly frustrated. And Mr. Holland and his wife are having an argument because Mr. Holland's saying just give him what he wants, and his wife is saying I want to, but I can't communicate with him. I don't know what he wants, and I can't talk to him, and I can't tell him that I love him, and I just want to talk to my son. And it's all about her wanting to take their son to this special school, which ends up being the best, quote unquote, the best school in the state for students with hearing disabilities. The next scene is them taking a look at the school, and it ends up being a school that teaches students sign language in addition to a part of a regular curriculum. And so it's also underlining that the parents should also be learning sign language as well. And so the idea being that we're not going to necessarily force Cole to learn how to hear with a 90% hearing deficiency, but rather we're going to teach Cole the skills to be able to communicate, and also teach the parents the skills to be able to communicate back and forth, and in this case using American Sign Language. And again, we kind of see that start to take off. A little bit later on in the movie, John Lennon, it's a pivotal moment in the movie where John Lennon ends up being killed. Not John Lennon, that part doesn't get shown. It's more like the news reporting of John Lennon being killed. Mr. Holland is very distraught from this, and when he comes home, him and Cole get in a fight about this because he just kind of dismisses Cole and says, "You wouldn't understand." He goes inside. His wife is comforting him when Cole comes in and starts to sign with him, and asks, Mr. Holland. Cole asks Iris, Mr. Holland's wife, to interpret because he wants to make sure he's being understood. And it's clear at that point that Mr. Holland hasn't been taking the sign language quite as seriously as Iris has been. So in that course of the conversation, we find out that Cole has taken an interest in what's important to Mr. Holland, and that's music. He knows who the Beatles are, and he knows who John Lennon is, and the whole time Mr. Holland has thought that Cole wouldn't be able to understand or appreciate this stuff because he has this hearing loss. The reality is that he does have an appreciation for this stuff, and it was just this lack of understanding from Mr. Holland towards Cole. The next scene in the movie is Mr. Holland trying to find a way to communicate another form of music with people that have hearing loss. And so he's talking with people, specialists at the school, about how they can create a performance system to communicate the emotion of music. And they end up coming with lights and using vibrations on the floor, and then we see them doing a concert where Mr. Holland sings Beautiful Boy, a song by John Lennon, to Cole. The very end of the movie, we go through a couple more parts of the movie, but the very end of the movie, we're greeted with a letter from Cole to his parents talking about he's gone on to become a professor of sorts, and he alludes that he's gotten a very generous offer from a school in DC, but he doesn't know if he wants to go there. It's implied, it's not said, but it's implied that it's Gallaudet, which is a very famous deaf university in DC. And then we see Cole showing up at the end and kind of helping to wrap up this last scene in the movie. In terms of the portrayal of somebody who has a hearing deficiency, I think they did a really great job of kind of targeting what that would look like from early on to kind of the middle part of his life to, it seems, around high school age, and then again beyond. They showed Cole doing things that you wouldn't necessarily think of somebody that has deafness being able to do. tinkering with a car and being able to fix it, but being able to use the vibrations. You see a scene where he's fixing a car, and he has a looks like a screwdriver, and he's holding it up to his head to listen to the vibrations or feel the vibrations of the car to be able to get information from the car to be able to do whatever it is. And bless him, I have no idea what he's doing in the car because Lord knows I'm not car savvy. But he's able to do everything that a hearing person's able to do. It's just in a different way. We see another scene in the movie where Mr. Holland and his wife come downstairs, and it seems to be very late at night, and Cole's sitting on a speaker, and he's feeling the vibrations, and he's listening to music, but it's his way of feeling the music. The funny thing is, earlier in the movie, Mr. Holland is sharing a story with his students, and this is shortly after we find out that Cole is deaf. He's sharing a story with his students about Mozart, and Mozart had created the Seventh Symphony as a response to critics saying that he couldn't compose music anymore. And the Seventh Symphony was composed right after it was found out that he was deaf. He had sawed off the legs on his piano so that he could rest the body of the piano on the floor, and then he could lay on the floor and then pound the keys so he could feel the vibrations. And one of the students asked him, how did he know, Mozart know, a C was, a C, or a D was a D? And Mr. Holland says, well, he wasn't born deaf. And you can kind of see this moment where Mr. Holland is reflecting on that of, well, his son is born with a hearing loss and wouldn't have been able to know a C is a C and a D is a D. But then we find out later on, again in the movie, Cole can still feel and enjoy and interpret music, even though he might not necessarily interpret it and feel it the same way. He can still enjoy it. And again, that's the scene with him sitting on a stereo speaker with volume cranked to 11, listening to it. One of the things, I had a opportunity for my undergrad. I did my undergrad at RIT, the Rochester Institute of Technology. And one of the things that's really, really interesting about that school is that part of it is the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which I did not know when I applied for school at RIT. First week of school, I showed up, and it's about 1,100 students of the school end up being either deaf or hard of hearing. And I showed up for classes, and I'm like, why are there all these deaf people around here? Come to find out, NTID is part of the campus. If you're a person with hearing difficulties, there are two big colleges in the U.S., Gallaudet, which is known for its liberal arts education, and RIT, or NTID, which is known for its technical school. Again, didn't know this when I applied for school. I just ended up going there to RIT and then ended up having this really, really unique opportunity. So I got a chance to live in what they call a mainstream world. It's where deaf, hard of hearing, and hearing all kind of live together. And I got a chance to peek behind the curtain a little bit and get a sense of what it would be like to be deaf a little bit. Again, I have full hearing, so I don't have the same kind of struggles on a daily basis, but I got a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. Going through this movie and seeing some of the frustrations that Cole felt, especially when he was younger, or the frustrations that his mom felt before they were able to start signing and communicating, absolutely I could understand where that child was coming from. And I can only imagine what it would have been like in a classroom setting where he wouldn't have been able to communicate. Once they started sending him to a school where sign language was prevalent and the ability to communicate started to happen, the type of life that he had, the quality of life that he had, at least with his mother, improved dramatically. It took a turning point with his father when his father realized that Cole had an interest in what he did for a living and that he could experience music. Maybe not exactly the same way that Mr. Holland did, but he could experience it and he could appreciate it and he wanted to. And then that's when the kind of relationship with his father kind of took a turn and started to improve. But again, the frustrations that they felt early on in that inability to communicate, I could certainly understand. And then the ability to communicate all of a sudden changed things so dramatically for them. I certainly kind of experienced that when I was at RIT, where I had students and friends of mine that if I couldn't communicate with them because they were deaf or hard of hearing, it was really, really frustrating because you just want to talk and be a part of each other's lives, and you couldn't. I remember one particular instance. We were in a physics class. The interpreter didn't show up, and there was one student in class who was deaf. And I said to the TA, "Hey, this student's interpreter didn't show up. You want to make a call or something?" And they were like, "Well, he can read lips." And I said, "What good is that going to do him if the professor's got his back to the class the whole time he's writing on the board?" The TA ended up leaving the room. I did my best to try and help translate in that class, which he might not have gotten much out of the class, but I did what I could. And I remember the student being very, very grateful afterwards. It was not the best class in the world. I'm not an interpreter by any stretch of the imagination, but it was something that I felt like I could do and try to help. And part of it was I could see the frustration on this student's face that the service that they needed wasn't being provided, and this assumption that, well, they can read lips, it'll be fine. But that doesn't fix everything, especially for somebody who has a profound hearing loss. And so, again, those kind of moments that happen in the movie, I think that they did a really, really great job of kind of targeting that and showing that and letting the audience feel a little bit of that throughout the movie. So, you know, I again, this is one of my favorite movies. I absolutely love it. I've seen it a dozen times at least, and I have it on DVD. And so being able to watch it again was just fun, and being able to watch it in the context of this class was fun. One thing I do want to mention, in terms of classifications for New York, deafness, it's a hearing impairment that is so severe that the student is impaired in processing linguistic information through hearing with or without amplification that adversely affects a student's educational experience. So if we were looking at classifications, that would probably be the one for Cole. And again, it would be, you know, what kind of services could we provide? You know, Cole was in that specialized school where they were teaching sign language, which was a way to help, you know, him communicate. It showed him at the end with hearing aids. So, you know, having that as an option certainly could. Maybe having a teacher with a microphone that, you know, transmits to the hearing aid, that might be something to help with that limited hearing capabilities that he has. You know, being able to kind of help develop that or kind of reach that. That might be something else as a service that we might be able to provide as an educator, so that Cole can have the same experiences that other students are having in the general classroom. Again, he ended up being a professor at a college, so it sounds like educationally things worked out pretty well for him. We don't know the full story of it because we only got kind of snapshots of him. Again, the movie focused on Mr. Holland, not necessarily Cole. But you know, those are some of the different things that I did pick up on the movie. So I hope you liked my review, and let me know if you have any questions.